You are here to be informed when the zombie apocalypse does happen on what we need to do. My name is Jen Benz. I'm the Director of Theater here at Pacific Science Center. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is Casimo coming here and presenting various talks. We've had how you react to a vampire, a couple of those talks. So we are in for a treat for one more night of what happens here in the stronghold. How can we recognize the zombie apocalypse is happening and what to do about it? With that, Kaitlyn.
Hello, everybody, and hello to our folks online as well. The emerging zombie plague has resulted in thousands of undead, mindless, ravenous, wandering Seattle from our defensible stronghold here at PacSci, which is somewhat less defensible now that the gates are open to all. How can we use neuroscience to learn about what is happening in the zombie disease and how it affects the brain? So we're going to learn about some different ways of measuring the brain, some brain regions that I think are affected in zombies based on what we know the function of those brain regions are, and my theory of what is happening in the zombie brain and what we can do about it. So, first, what do we know about the zombie disease? It is definitely transmissible, and specifically through fluids. People who are bitten but get away without being eaten inevitably turn into zombies themselves. The incubation rate, or the incubation time, is about 3 to 5 days, meaning the time between the bite and the zombie symptoms starting to emerge, which are behavioral symptoms to start, and that there is no cure rate observed. There's been no individuals who have been cured by any treatments or healed through their own immune system. It's really rare for infectious diseases to affect the nervous system like this. It's hard for pathogens that cause diseases to enter the brain, but it's not impossible. Rabies is a really good example of an infectious disease that affects the nervous system. And rabies is also virtually uncurable. Over many years of research, we now have treatments that can prevent a person who has been exposed to rabies from developing rabies, but only if they're treated before they develop symptoms. Only 14 people ever have been known to have been cured of rabies after they showed symptoms. So, in our zombies as well, after you show symptoms, no one has yet been cured. So, speaking of symptoms, our zombies show a distinct behavioral profile. They have a hunger for flesh, specifically human flesh. They lose the ability to engage with anything but that hunger for flesh. No personality, decisions are reduced to just the immediate reward of food, which is humans, and they don't demonstrate a sleep-wake cycle. They can still sense the environment as evidenced by following prey, which is to say, you. But their senses are degrading over time as their body starts to break down. And their body is breaking down as they lose homeostasis. And from their behavior, we can assume the brain is breaking down too. But then the question is, what brain regions? So based on the behaviors we observe, what parts of the brain might be affected in zombies? And how could we measure them to find out? So before I go on to explore how we are measuring different parts of the brain's activity, I need to introduce why we want to measure specific parts of the brain. That's because different parts of the brain have different jobs, which is called functional localization. Where the damage happens in the brain has an immense influence on the types of behavioral impacts that we see as a result of that brain damage. Some brain regions are more specialized and some functions are more localized, but other things are much more flexible. More complex functions are especially difficult to localize, things like personality. Also, the brain has an amazing ability to remap itself after damage, after injury, or in the case of congenital differences in brain development, that other parts of the brain can take on jobs that they don't normally take on. So, movement is one of the most distinctive things impacted in zombie behavior. On the left, I'm showing you a human brain with the front of the head on the left side of the image. So we're looking at the left side of the brain, which controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. I have a few brain regions that are especially important for sensing and movement highlighted. These two functions are really highly linked because if you want to be able to move, you have to be able to take into account what you're sensing from the environment. The primary sensory motor cortex is responsible for processing inputs from touch, which is far from the only sense that informs movement. The posterior parietal cortex is especially involved in planning movement and spatial reasoning. And then the premotor cortex, do I have a mouse? Do I have a mouse on here?
Yep.
I don't see my mouse. There it is. The primary somatosensory cortex, and then we have the premotor cortex here, which is even farther downstream in the planning process of movements, getting down to the level of executing which specific muscles are going to be necessary. And then finally, we have the primary motor cortex, which actually sends commands to the muscles. All of this is quite obviously disrupted in our shambling zombies. So these are regions that we're highly interested in recording from in their brains to determine what exactly is going on. The basal ganglia, which is my middle image here, is a collection of brain regions that's deep inside of the brain, and they're heavily involved in movements, and especially movement precision, making sure that those movements are highly fine-tuned, and also in rewards. And it may seem counterintuitive for reward and movement to be so closely linked, but it's because if something is rewarding, then you want to drive movement towards it. So that we have reward leading directly to point A to point B. This image here of the basal ganglia shows where they're located deep under the surface of the brain. They're deep down the middle. And they form a notoriously complex circuit with multiple interlocking and opposing pathways that turn each other up and down. I'm not going to walk you through the details of this group of regions, but just know that it's crucially important for effective movement and for seeking rewards, like food. Like you are food. And finally, balance is a very particular type of motor control, and it's especially associated with the cerebellum. Balance consists of micro-movements from muscles to adjust for differences in terrain and your own movement. And it also takes into account vestibular input, which is your sense of body position and rotation. And that actually comes from the inside of the ears. Balance is a lot harder than it looks because your brain takes care of all of it outside of your awareness, which you can see very well in bipedal robots that are just so bad at walking. It is a really difficult skill to keep good balance, and zombies are not great at it either. So this is another region that we are also very interested in. And the cerebellum is highlighted on this rotating brain here. It is down in the back, just at the base of the skull at the top of the spinal cord. So next up, we have homeostasis functions. Homeostasis is the body's attempt to remain in equilibrium across its symptoms, or across all of its systems. This includes things like sleep and wake, temperature, thirst, and hunger. So in zombies, the sleep-wake cycle is suppressed. They don't show sleep the way that a healthy human does. Hunger is dramatically increased and also highly focused. And thirst seems suppressed, but it may just be that they're getting enough of their thirst sated via the blood of their victims. All of these functions are linked to the hypothalamus, which is shown here with the little arrow is pointing to that brain region. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine system, which means hormones, which are released in the pituitary gland, which is part of the brain, but then those hormones are molecular signals that circulate in the blood. That is all a hormone is. There's lots of different types. The pituitary gland's hormones are one of the main ways that the brain can send signals to the body. And in zombies, it appears that some of these systems are turned up, they're more active, and in some of them, they're turned down, they're suppressed. Finally, some more complex brain functions. On the left here, I'm showing you the prefrontal cortex, which is linked to executive functions like decision-making, risk assessment, and personality. So this is showing the left prefrontal cortex, which is located right around here at the front of the head, and it's mirrored on the right side as well. This diagram is just showing you the left. So these functions, like personality, are all highly impaired in zombies, and they particularly seem to be the first cognitive symptoms to appear after the infection, suggesting that the disease is starting at the front of the brain and moving its way backwards. Note also that I'm highlighting like 20% of the brain here and not getting more specific. We can identify parts of the prefrontal cortex that are associated with specific functions. There's a sub-area called Broca's area that is highly associated with language, for example. But the specificity is definitely less cut and dry with the prefrontal cortex than it is with a lot of more ancient brain areas that achieve more concrete tasks. And on the right here, we have the amygdala. People often think of the amygdala as being linked to fear, but it's more generally linked to strong emotions of any kind. And also helping link those emotions to memories. Zombies don't seem to experience most emotions as far as we can tell, but their behavioral repertoire is also so limited, it's kind of hard to know. They don't react with fear to stimuli that they would have been afraid of before their infection. So it is pretty clear that the amygdala is affected. So these are the brain regions that we are interested in. These two, we also have the basal ganglia, the motor cortex, the cerebellum, and the hypothalamus. So how do we measure these? We can use a variety of different methods to study the brain and determine exactly what the disease is doing to the brain's physical structures and to its function. And this can be at different scales, from individual molecules and individual cells up to psychology, to the whole brain working together to lead to behavior. And we can use different neurosciences disciplines to shape our overall understanding of the problem. We haven't captured a zombie yet to test these things on, but let's start designing some experiments and see what we think would happen when we get to do that. So, MRI. We can measure both anatomy of the brain and the activity of the brain using an MRI. And this will help provide a useful baseline to interpret the other data that we're going to get. So, anatomical MRI can be calibrated in different ways to show different things, such as tissue versus fluid, or gray matter versus white matter, which means where the cell bodies are located versus the axons, which are the long, skinny parts that connect cells to each other, brain cells. We can also use anatomical MRI to determine what parts of the brain may have been physically damaged by the zombie disease. So on the left, we have an anatomical MRI of a healthy human brain. The face is on the left, and we're scrolling from one ear to the other in slices, going horizontally across the brain. So this is a healthy brain, but we would expect to see brain damage in a zombie on an anatomical MRI. And I suspect that it would be in those brain regions that we just discussed, and it would show up on an anatomical MRI as dark spots, where the tissue has turned into fluid because there's been damage. Functional MRI instead measures blood flow in the brain, specifically how much oxygen is there in the blood. And it tells us where there's demand for oxygen, which then implies that that brain region is activated and drawing in oxygen, and therefore we think that that brain region's function is being called on. In this brain on the right, the face is at the top of the image, and we are looking at a slice at around the level of a little bit higher than the eyes. So the back of the brain is at the bottom of the image, and that area is the visual cortex. What happens where the activity is happening is showing us that this person is looking at something interesting because the visual cortex is activated. However, MRIs require the person being imaged to sit still, to sit very still. But we can strap them down, even in healthy people who are getting an MRI, and we can explain the process to them. We will strap the head down using a foam pad to minimize movement. And there's also some really interesting research on correcting for movement in MRIs, which was actually designed for being able to take in utero MRIs of fetuses before they're born. So this method of taking an MRI from a zombie has potential, with some caveats. I will not be the one to strap the zombie down. And we would expect to see some anatomical damage to the brain, as well as unusual patterns of activity in places like the motor cortex and the hypothalamus. All right, now let's look at cellular activity. Neurons talk to each other using molecules called neurotransmitters. And signals move within neurons using an electrochemical process, which means that we have charged atoms moving in and out of the cell, and it generates an electrical field. So we can measure that using the electricity that the cells produce. This is called electrophysiology, or EPHIS. All of these methods tell us about a cell or a group of cells' activity, which we can then link to different stimuli or behaviors depending on what context we collected the data in. So none of this tells us what neurotransmitters are affected, it just tells us about what the cells are doing, their activity within the cell. So first we have technology that can be used on tissue extracted from a brain called PacSci. Eventually we're going to get a zombie that we can get this kind of a sample from. It measures the electrical activity in a single cell, which can be from any of the brain regions that we discussed. And it would tell us if the disease is killing off cells entirely, or if it's altering the cell's function. I suspect that the problem is from the cells just dying off. This method is very detailed, but it also only records from one cell at a time, and it's really challenging to get a good recording. All right. EEG tells us about how groups of cells in specific brain regions that we're interested in are firing as groups. It's measuring groups of cells from outside of the head, so the signals are traveling through the skull, through the fluids, through the muscles, and so forth, which impacts the signal's quality and how well we can tell where the signal's coming from. But it doesn't require surgery, and it doesn't require us to extract a tissue sample. Unfortunately, EEG also works best when the subject holds very still, and we can only restrain a zombie so much. And it only effectively records from the outer layers of the brain. And some of the brain regions that we're interested in, like the amygdala and the hypothalamus, are deep down inside. So EEG can't tell us very much about those regions. I want to make sure that we remember that we've learned a lot about what's happening in the zombie brain just by observing its behavior and combining it with what we already know about what brain regions are associated with different functions. We have some very good guesses about what brain regions are affected from these observations alone. And that's just from behaviors we see in the wild. That's before we do any standardized behavioral testing on a zombie. For example, if we were to put the zombie in a maze test, would it be able to learn and remember the solution in order to find a rewarding chunk of human flesh at the end of the maze? Could it learn commands in exchange for a reward of delicious human flesh? Unfortunately, as the only thing that seems to motivate them is humans, it will be difficult to get samples for testing. But we can learn a lot from these kinds of standardized behavioral tests that we have lots of baseline data about how humans perform in a healthy, natural setting. Finally, another way we can investigate what is happening inside of the brain is either by administering a drug and observing its effects, or by identifying what drugs the current behaviors and cognitive functions resemble. So L-DOPA is a precursor molecule that your brain uses to produce dopamine. It also is used to make epinephrine and norepinephrine, but dopamine is the one we're interested in right now. We can directly observe the effect that L-DOPA has on movement in people who have Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's, neurons in a region called the substantia nigra die off. Substantia nigra just means black stuff. The region is so dense with this type of neuron that it's literally black when you cut the brain open. And those brain cells are dying off. And that if we give a person L-DOPA, then it helps the brain produce dopamine to replace what those cells would have been generating. The substantia nigra is part of the basal ganglia, which, as you may recall, is one of the brain regions that we are suspicious of in zombies. Without L-DOPA, Parkinson's patients have tremors. That's the most famous symptom. But they often also have bradykinesia, which means overly slow movements or difficulty initiating movements. This sounds a lot like a less extreme version of how zombies move. So we can test L-DOPA to see its effect on zombies' movements, for example. THC acts on endocannabinoid receptors, which is actually what led to the discovery of endocannabinoids, which are neurotransmitters that your own brain makes that cannabis emulates. THC has medical uses like suppressing nausea. It can also cause disorganized behavior, slowed movement, and the munchies, in this case for brains. So we can guess that brain cells in regions with high levels of endocannabinoid receptors may be especially affected by the zombie disease, which include the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which we already guessed earlier might be involved. So, what is my hypothesis of the zombie disease, and how could this inform prevention and treatment? There's many different infectious agents that could cause this type of symptoms, but here is my current theory: a mutated version of Naegleria fowleri, or the brain-eating amoeba. It forms cysts that can survive in cold water for long periods, dormant until the temperature gets better. And when the water warms up, it becomes the flagellate phase on the right, where it has two flagella, little tails, that help it swim around and feed in the water. If a person gets infected water up their nose, it then transforms into the trophozoite phase, which is the one in the middle here. It has pseudopods, the little amoeba feet, and it can just ooze along the olfactory nerve from the nose along the underside of the brain and into the brain. During this phase, it will feed on any bacteria that it finds, and then your brain tissue, and it reproduces. I have a few reasons. This is my top candidate disease. It attacks the brain, number one, which most infectious diseases cannot do. And it targets specific brain regions preferentially. It enters via the olfactory nerve up the nose, which is adjacent to the prefrontal cortex. And it attacks the hypothalamus early on in the infection. And it's known to reproduce in human flesh. N. fowleri is very rare. There have only ever been about 400 cases on record as of 2018, of which about 40% were in the United States. And it is especially uncommon here in the Northwest because it is too cold, though with climate change that risk is increasing. It's usually found in places with warm, fresh water, like across the South and even in Australia. But it has also emerged in warm water in Minnesota and London, so it could happen in a climate like ours. And this is clearly a mutant form anyway, since unlike the regular infection, it causes those it infects to eat people. And it's transmitted by bite, whereas the common form is only transmitted via the water. A person can't spread this infection to another person. But why not? If it also mutated to cause zombie symptoms and to be transmissible by bite, why not also have mutated to survive in lower temperatures? This is a real CAT scan from a patient who had primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, which is the disease caused by the wild form of N. fowleri. On both of these images, the face is at the top and we're cutting horizontally through the brain. The one on the left is an image closer to the top of the brain, and it shows damage to the basal ganglia, one of the brain regions that we suspect to be involved. And in the image on the right, we see extra fluid in the space around the midbrain, which is adjacent to the hypothalamus. However, we only have anatomical imaging from N. fowleri patients, so we don't know how brain activity might have been affected. Most patients end up in a coma pretty quickly. But if my theory is right, this doesn't bode very well for our chances at a cure. This type of brain damage where the tissue has been eaten away is irreversible. Even if we could grow new neurons, which we currently can't in a clinical setting, the functions that were associated with the lost tissue would remain lost. So, now what? Only 4 people have ever survived N. fowleri in North America, out of about 150 total cases. In those cases, they were overloaded with antimicrobials, antibacterials, and antifungals, like amphotericin B, which is what's pictured here, which inhibit crucial functions of the amoeba. But a lot of it just seems to come down to luck. We have not hit on a treatment for N. fowleri that consistently works. Our odds are much better of just trying to prevent the disease from spreading in the first place. First, this means bite prevention. Anyone who must go outside needs to be wearing clothing that zombies can't bite through, like what they use for security dog training. That includes their head, their hands, the works. Assuming the amoeba theory is right, we still don't know where patient 0 picked it up. Again, people can only be infected by the unmutated typical form of this amoeba via infected water. But if we can prevent bites, we can prevent transmission. So we can't just ask zombies to wear masks, so we're just going to have to get creative. There's also a vaccine in development, which would stimulate the body to make antibodies and help your own immune system attack the amoebas, but it has never been tested It's only theoretical. They modeled it in the immune system, and it looks like it would work, but the disease is so rare they haven't actually been able to test it on a person and see whether it prevented the disease. We'll need to capture a zombie in order to test any of these theories that we have about the brain and the disease. And using these same protection methods, get some brain scans and eventually an autopsy so we can figure out exactly what's going on here. And in the meantime, maybe don't go swimming in warm water, just in case. All right. Questions?
So, perhaps it wouldn't have needed to evolve to survive in cold water if it primarily is infected via fluid.
That's a great point. So the question was, maybe it wouldn't have needed to evolve to survive in cold water if it's being transmitted via fluid-to-fluid contact. That's a great point. Maybe our patient 0 picked it up on a trip to somewhere with warmer water and brought it back here before they started showing any symptoms. That's a great point. Did I see a question over here?
I'll ask, since they seem to be driven by hunger, or the only thing I keep hearing nowadays are GLP-1s. You think that might be promising avenue to look into?
So that's a great question. So the question was, since they seem to be driven by hungers, do we think that GLP-1s could be an effective mechanism for slowing the zombies down and helping us get away from them? That is a great question. I am not sure that a GLP-1 would work here because GLP-1s slow stomach emptying and they help promote a feeling of satiety, and they also have some impacts on metabolism. But since these zombies seem to be acting like they're hungry at all times, even if they've just eaten, would a GLP-1 be able to cause that feeling of satiety, of feeling full, if the hypothalamus is damaged in such a way that it's not receiving those signals? Even if we're sending those signals in, it might be that there's nowhere for them to be received by. Yeah, and then that does also beg the question of because GLP-1s, there is no currently oral form of the drug, it has to be injected, that we would have to get out there and inject the zombies with drug. I mean, I guess you could use like a tranquilizer dart for that. The ones that they have at the zoo for tranquilizer darts. We'll have to get up to the stronghold of the zoo for that one. But yeah, I would worry that where the GLP-1 signal would be acting on in the brain may not be able to be receiving those signals. But that's another great drug that we could test to see what impact it does or does not have, which would tell us something about brain function. I like it. Did I see another question? Yeah. Yeah, the hypothalamus is where those hunger signals are handled.
Okay, so the hypothalamus is driving hunger, and if the body is exhibiting hungry behaviors, would that imply that the hypothalamus is functional?
So the question was, if the zombie is acting like it's hungry, does that imply that the hypothalamus is functional? Kind of. It implies that there's some amount of function, but hunger and fullness are actually two opposing sets of signals. It's extraordinarily complicated. There's a bunch of different hormones involved. So it is possible that the satiety signals are still getting sent in, or the hunger signals are still being sent in, but the satiety signals are not. So then the hunger is still there. Have you ever experienced feeling both hungry and full at the same time? I have. And so it could be that even if the hypothalamus is still receiving signals, I'm full, you don't need to eat anymore. I'm hungry, I still want to eat. And that that's sort of permanently switched on, that even if a I'm full signal comes in, if the I'm hungry signal is still on, then it's just going to go eat Pringles at midnight out of the pantry. You know? So I don't think the hunger signal still being present definitively tells us that the hypothalamus is working as intended. Yeah. Here and then here.
That N-filaria, I think it was called, is usually present in warm, fresh water. Does that mean it cannot survive in salt water?
So the question was, N. fowleri, is it found only in freshwater? And the answer is yes, it is only found in freshwater. I mean, I don't think saltwater is going to necessarily be super effective at dealing with an infection, but if there's a lot of salt in the body, they can survive some amount of salt. But yes, it is in the wild only found in freshwater. Here and then here.
I'm curious if fungus cordyceps be an agent of zombies as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So would the fungus cordyceps also cause zombieism? Okay, I'm gonna drop character here and remind you all that zombies aren't real. So for my very first Science in the City for Halloween 10 years ago, cordyceps was what caused the zombie disease. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, this is a very real fungus that infects ants, and that it takes control of their behavior. So when the fungus gets into the ant, then it gets into its head, literally, not it's messing with psychology. No, it is literally inside of its head, and then it drives the ant to climb up a tall leaf or stalk of grass or a twig, and then latch down with its jaws, which ants have really strong jaws, and it locks into place, and then it dies, and then its head bursts open, and the fruiting body of the fungus gets released onto the wind. So it is an extraordinarily complex behavioral response that this fungus drives the ant to act on. It specifically crawls up somewhere high. It latches its jaw down. So yeah, that's a very specific example in an animal with a much simpler nervous system than a human. But yeah, that is a really great example of how this kind of thing actually can happen in real life. Yes?
So you said clean fresh water. What about pools?
Yeah. So the question was, N. fowleri, it can be found in fresh water. It doesn't necessarily have to be clean water, actually. And could it be found in a pool? Yes, it could be found in a pool. If that pool is chlorinated properly, then that would kill it. So a chlorinated pool is safe. Yeah. Yeah, saltwater. It's a freshwater amoeba, so saltwater pool would also be safe. Yeah. Only cold ponds. You can only be uncomfortable if you're going to go swim in a pond. Yeah. Yes.
Strategy for survival of the outbreak would just be lockdown. Because
so the question was, what is the lifespan of a zombie, and B, could an effective strategy for dealing with zombie outbreak be a lockdown? So would the lifespan of a zombie not being fed be short enough that we could handle it just by staying inside for a certain amount of time? That's a great question. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly how long a human can survive without food. It is on the order of several weeks. Zombies, I think would probably be about the same. Even though they're decomposing, they still need energy in order to move. So if we could somehow get everyone to stay inside for say 3 weeks, it should work. Unless they then can eat other animals, and then I don't think that would work. If they prefer humans but are not an obligate anthrovore. What's the Latin word for human?
Yeah.
Humanivore, as opposed to a general carnivore. Then it wouldn't work. It's the same reason why it's really difficult to eradicate diseases that have an animal reservoir. So we successfully eradicated smallpox. Yay, go us! Because it only infects humans, which is why we were able to corner it. Versus, say, the influenza, that virus can also be found depending on what type of flu it is in birds, in other mammals, in pigs, in cows. So it's much more difficult to try to eradicate the flu than it was to eradicate smallpox, or polio is almost eradicated. The other disease that has been successfully eradicated is a worm, spacing on the name, that only infected domesticated cattle. So they were able to eliminate this worm because of that, because it only had one host. So I guess that's my answer. If the zombies will only eat humans, then we could probably solve it with a lockdown. And if they eat other animals, then yes. Did I say a question over here?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if they're decomposing,
Yes.
right, how long does it take for that to reach their brain itself?
So the question was, if they're decomposing, how long would that take to reach the brain itself? So the disease is attacking the brain directly and preferentially. So it's going to be less time than it otherwise would be for decomposition. But that's a great question. I don't actually know how long it takes the body to decompose. I read a lot of mysteries, and this has not come up somehow.
You have your new niche. This is coming
Yeah, no, I stay tuned for cozy mysteries about science. I'm not kidding. The brain is really energy intensive.
Well, by that token too, then, as the brain is getting eaten away by the amoeba, maybe it's not even like that.
Yeah. As the for those online, as the brain is getting eaten by the amoeba, the brain is a very energy intensive organ. So if the brain is being eaten away by the amoeba, it's going to have less energy requirement. Do we have any online questions?
4 to 6 weeks.
In the same vein, could we posture that a zombie's metabolism would slow over time just as a human's does? Like children and adolescents require more food than adults do, so would the same go for zombies?
So the question was, would a zombie's metabolism slow over time as they decompose? I think their metabolism, I don't know if their metabolism would slow down. Probably their homeostasis is thrown off, and that's driving metabolism. But that as they're decomposing, they have less body mass that needs energy to carry forward with its function. So, yes.
Related to that question, if like we could wait this out with a lockdown, would that amoeba, does it have like the ability to kick in some sort of like survival mode where then it's like requiring less energy to try to like drag that out a little bit, or does it not have a way to kind of throttle the way it's affecting its host?
Yeah. So the question was, if we went into lockdown, would we have to wait out the amoeba being in like its cyst form versus a more active, the trophocyte form that requires more energy? And that it doesn't form the cysts in the brain. It only forms the cysts in water. So it would not go into that more dormant state in a brain. So I think we're good on that front.
What about the getting rid of the bodies? What would you need to do to make sure that nothing's transmitted?
So the question was, what would we need to do with the zombie bodies to make sure that they are not a vector for the disease as well? I would probably cremate them just to be safe. Yeah.
We do have an online question.
By growing, giving them lab-grown flesh to domesticate them.
Yeah.
Could we give the zombies lab-grown human flesh in order to sort of pacify them? Is that the question?
Or whatever domestic transport we want to do. Does it involve like
What you sleep?
We can grow human muscles in a lab. We can grow actually quite a lot of human like cell and tissue types in the lab. The trouble is then going from growing cells and tissues to growing whole organs, which have more complex structure. Then a tissue is like a relatively simple, generally only has one type of cell, versus an organ has multiple types of cells. It might have blood vessels in it. And that increase in complexity is really challenging. But like we want to capture a zombie and use it in experimental testing in the lab. I don't see any reason why lab-grown human muscle fibers wouldn't work for that. Yeah.
Kind of like
Yeah, like Pringles for zombies. We have an online question, and then
It is getting slightly off the zombie topic. We have someone online asking, where did you get your cute ghost sweater? / would the ghosts be afraid of the zombies?
the question online was, where did I get my ghost sweater? Thank you, person on the internet. I got it at a store called Paddington in Ashland, Oregon, and I think I got the last one.
Following from the human lab, have we observed zombies at any point eating carrion, like other dead humans? Because it seems like they have a drive specifically for living flesh, otherwise they would be self-consuming.
Oh, that's a great question.
So would we even be able to motivate zombies with like a hunk of flesh and not like a live person?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so the question was, are zombies specifically wanting to eat living flesh versus, pre-processed, shall we say. And that's a great question. I think we would have to test it. I think the more decomposed the zombie is, the more likely it is to eat the packaged meats. But that also, like, you can, to an extent, for like feeding carnivores at like the zoo or for pets, you can like trick them to a little bit. So like if you're feeding a snake, you take a mouse that has already been euthanized and you heat it up in warm water so it's body temperature, and then you hold it with like a little claw and like jiggle it so it moves. And that snakes have very poor vision. They hunt based on thermoreceptors, so they have along the front of their snout, they have little pits that can detect infrared heat. So they're sensing the heat and they're smelling the mouse, and that little bit of movement is enough to fool them. So I think we could probably do something like that.
So it's a matter of like testing what about.
Yeah, what is it? Like, would it eat non-living humans? We haven't tested that. And if it would not, what can we do that might replicate the dining experience? Yes, here and then here.
So zombies, I might be doing a little zombie mythology here, but like
This is all zombie mythology.
I always see them as being like relentlessly strong movies. But how are they tracking you if their body's decomposing? It seems like their vision, all those things are away, so how are they not being mystified by closed doors?
Yeah, so I think they are mostly mystified by closed doors, but to your point about strength, like you hear sometimes about people like in extreme situations who pull off these incredible feats of strength, and that often they have injured themselves and they only realize it afterwards. That like the adrenaline is pumping, and that suppresses the pain signals. So the feats of strength that we see from some zombies, I would attribute to the same thing, that it's that their pain receptors are no longer working properly. So they're driving their body to accomplish things that are actually a bad idea. Pain is a signal to tell you, hey, that thing is doing damage to you, knock it off. And that in the zombie, if that is no longer working, but it's not really necessary anymore to them. Like that's not their primary drive, is to survive. But then, yeah, also like as far as them being able to hunt and track, like if they're more decomposed, they're going to be worse at that. Yeah.
Let's talk about possibly terrifying aspects of mass fast zombies. So, kind of thinking about your theory about this behavior, one part of behaviors existing with that those victims may eventually be more control. But there's just not a more for that. So they're out of control at this moment of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to me that once a zombie becomes a zombie, right, they have the capability to move that far. They have motivation to move on. They have motivation to go. So it's not going to be just an automatic, like, it's going to be
Yeah, that intermediate phase between they're infected and that basically, does the drive to eat flesh arrive first, or does the impact to the motor system arrive first? Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on the specific spread pattern of the amoeba. So it's entering through the olfactory bulb, which is on the underside of the front of the brain. And then if it goes more towards the hypothalamus and is traveling sort of along the base of the brain first, that could spark that hunger for flesh first. But then the motor cortex is still unaffected. Versus if it travels more up towards the top of the brain first, into the prefrontal cortex and into the motor regions, before it starts triggering the hunger, then it's a little bit of a safer situation. But yeah, it would depend on what order the brain regions are affected in. Potentially, yes. Yeah, would the fast zombies eat the slow zombies? Good question.
I have a potential can of worm question.
They're all can of worms.
So, I mean, you talked a little bit about wanting to be able to study these zombies, right? If we get them to sit still for long enough, like, where do ethics in like medical work, like, start to come into play with this? Like, when do they stop being a patient and start being like a threat to society?
Yeah. So the question was about the ethics of studying zombies, and like when do they stop being a patient and when do they start being a threat that needs to be dealt with and studied? That's a great question. And actually, as I was thinking through this in advance, I was thinking about other methods that we could use to study the brain that would require surgery. And what would the ethical implications of that specifically be? And that given that this is an emerging disease, could we ask people if they would be interested in consenting to participate in research in the event that they were infected? This is also a situation that has emerged rapidly for other studies. And this would be my preference if this situation would be viable. For some studies where they were working on like medical treatments for people, that it would only ever be used in a circumstance where the person was had a critical injury, was life-threatening, and they were unconscious. Like it would be used for like if they had been like in a car accident. And that there have been a couple of instances where they did this, where they, I think this was I don't remember if it was in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, I think it was in somewhere in Pennsylvania, that they like blanketed the local media with whatever medical center it is doing this trial. It'll only be used in circumstances where the people have had life-threatening injuries and have no other option. If you don't want to be part of this, please contact us by X date. And they worked on this opt-out system because basically the trial was for testing something that was an absolute last resort. And the trial went forward and actually it worked. So that it was to like super cool people's bodies while they were dealing with trauma injuries. And it worked. And the survival rate for those people with those really severe injuries increased. So that would be an option as well. It is also, there's a difference between like doing a behavioral experiment and observing, like, we put a zombie in a maze, then what happens? Versus we have a now dead zombie as opposed to an undead zombie, and we would like to extract tissue from it, versus we have a zombie and we'd like to take images of the brain, but it's not invasive. And those all require different types of consent, and that, like, where would we draw the line would, I think, depend on what type of thing we're asking to do. It's a very different thing if, like, to do, like, an MRI versus an autopsy. But yeah, I think my preferred solution would be if we can get people to say, hey, if I happen to be bitten, I volunteer. Yeah, it's a great question.
It would save you a lot of effort on the capture
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, it would save a lot of effort on the capture side if people said, hey, I've been bitten, I have 3 to 5 days, can I get myself to a secure location? And I think people would sign up for that. I would. All right, do we have any more questions? Any questions online? All right. Well, thank you for joining me. As a reminder, zombies are not real.
But do you feel more prepared if they do come out?
I hope you feel more prepared if they do emerge.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out to the Science in the City, the 10th anniversary with Kaitlyn. Woo! She will be back. We work a lot with her and her institution, the Allen Institute, and do a lot of different things like a brain fest that's going to come up in a few months.
March 21st.
March 21st. They have a date. So keep that in mind. A lot of things we've done in the past. We've had brain dissection on this giant screen. So lots of good stuff.
brain dissection.
Human brain dissection and a spinal cord. It was interesting. Yeah. Great stuff. And some of you have noted earlier on the way, you were talking about the Science Center has been closed for some renovations and some refreshing. And we open tomorrow. So come back, join us. We'll have more of these, more science in the movies coming up. If you enjoy the movie side of things and how this goes, paired this with a movie. We have one coming up on the 20th.
There's one tomorrow.
Oh, right. Tomorrow night. Sorry. Time.
Prometheus.
Today, Prometheus with another great partner, Fred Hutch. We'll be here. We're going to talk about that one. We have some other movies at Fear Fest. So lots of stuff going on in theaters. A lot of stuff going on. Spiders exhibit is opening up tomorrow as well.
Spiders.
Not Spider fan? No. Okay. So
How's seasonal though?
yes, it was very appropriate. So come back, check us out, see what we got going on, and we'll see you again soon.